We will start in about 3 minutes.
Sure. I've started the recording function.
Thank you. I saw it.
You're the best. Thanks, Fernando.
Hey, Casey, how are you? I thought you were on a plane or something.
I was supposed to be. I got on an earlier one on standby, so I just got back.
Okay. I feel like a fraud. I'm logged in as you.
Oftentimes there's 3 or 4 of me logged in. I like to change it up that way.
Yeah. All right. It's working, so I won't change anything.
Thank you so much.
I mean, I just really like to see myself in as a woman. As Casey.
It's a promotion, right? Come on.
Oh yeah.
So Casey, did you enjoy the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport?
Oh my God. I loved it so much that I stayed there for 16 hours. I just couldn't get enough of it.
Well, too bad I was not in town. You could have come over to my house.
The thing is that it was like, it just was hard to leave because there was never a clear point where it was like, oh, okay, like, it was like, it was getting scheduled back by hour increments until like 2 in the morning.
Oh, yeah.
Restarting at 7 in the morning.
Man.
And so there was no like good window to leave. It was great though. I saw so many angry mobs. It was like a great lesson in group psychology.
We have a bunch of new people joining. We have David Ansell, Dr. David Ansell. We have Liz, and we have Zdak.
Good. I know that David is joining us from vacation in Michigan.
Whoa.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for doing this.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. I'm with my grandkids, so I had to run to another room.
You don't think they want to talk about structural racism?
Hey, baby. Hey, baby.
How old are your grandkids, David?
3 and 7 months.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Whoa. Hello?
And I'm vacationing with them, so that's an interesting all by itself.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for taking the time to talk with us.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Definitely, we're gonna wait a little bit before we start. We just have 5 students online with us now, and the rest of the crew is us. So let's wait a little bit. Elise, ¿cómo ça va?
I like your pink outfit, Carlo.
Say it again.
I like your pink outfit.
Oh, thank you.
Looks
Thank
good.
you very much.
Vai, Cass. Comment parle sur ça veut dire là?
Ronaldo,
Ça mieux.
comment ça va?
Ah, ça va bien, beaucoup.
Comment tu vas faire pour suivre le cours? On va suivre.
On vous avez entendu?
Mais ouais, tu l'as dit, tu l'as dit en live.
Ah, I'm sorry.
Non, non, c'est bon, c'est bon. Écoute, on aura également besoin de toi hein, pour nous aider dans la traduction, si tu veux bien, bien sûr.
Yeah, merci d'avance. Et puis moi, Zazou. Ça passe, Zaz.
Ok, Stacy vient de nous rejoindre.
Bon bagay. Salut, Stace.
Toi, qu'est-ce qui sont hier?
La John
Salut. Stacy.
En forme, mais au même.
Merci.
Ben, à l'aise dans quoi? Mais ça me gâte, tu m'as parlé.
Salut Michel.
Bonjour, bonsoir tout le monde.
Bonsoir.
Bonsoir.
Comment allez-vous?
On va bien et toi?
Très bien, merci. Très chaud ici à Washington.
C'est partout pareil. En Haïti, c'est très très chaud.
Pas vrai.
Ouais.
Les nuages.
C'est vraiment chaud. Ok. On commence dans 2 minutes exactement. Il est 6h03. Et comme on l'a dit tantôt, on laisse 2 minutes, on voulait laisser 5 minutes pour retardataire. 6h03, on commence exactement dans 2 minutes. 1 minute à présent. Nous avons pour le moment en ligne Alexandra, en tant qu'étudiante, Alexandra, Rowena, Catherine, Ronaldo, Rosna, Ellie. Mais nous avons beaucoup d'autres personnes avec nous. Nous avons cet après-midi, nous devons accueillir Midi, qui va faire office de traductrice pour nous. Qui est une alumni du cours de médecine sociale. Elle a été dans la 2e promotion. David, do you speak French?
Je parle petit peu français. No, I don't.
But you have enough French to understand what I say.
Exactly.
Regardez-moi si une vidéo, papa. À boire qui n'est ça.
David, I hope I can see you on Thursday or Friday. And Fernando, I don't know if you're back in Chicago, but I'll be there for 24 hours to connect with Aletha Maybank for that. He's trying to do like some curriculum reform, some social medicine curriculum reform at the AMA.
Yeah, she's tremendous.
Yeah. Yeah, she's a real mover.
Mm-hmm. Hey guys, ready to start?
Sure.
It's 6:05, so we have to start now. Thanks everyone for being here, for creating the availability to share knowledge with us and to be with us in that webinar. Thank you, Fernando, for being our first presenter today. And thank you, David Ansell, to be our second presenter.
Sure.
And
Durian.
thank you. And thanks, Michelle, for joining us. Casey also, because I know that you are really tired from traveling, but really nice to have you. Let's do this. Let's do like usually. We start by presenting ourselves, our profession, our localization, and our number on the window. So I am Carl, and I am actually in Haiti, and I am a social worker, and my number on the window is one, a positive one, and I will call Fernando.
Great. Well, good evening, everybody. And my name is Fernando DeMaio. I'm a sociologist at DePaul University in Chicago. Like David, I don't have much French, so I will speak very slowly in hopes that you might understand and the translators will help. My number in the window, if I remember right, it's from a -10 to a +10. And I think right now I am a 3. And looking forward to the discussion today. And next I pass it to David.
My name is David Ansell. I'm a physician at Rush University in Chicago. And I look like am I supposed to say what window I am? I'm window 1. I'm glad to be here tonight.
Thank you very much. Okay, can you name someone else in the forum to continue? Can you call someone else, David?
Oh, I have to call on someone else?
Yes.
I'm going to call on Stacy.
Thank you. Stacy? Stacy?
Yes, I'm here, so I wasn't on mute. My
Okay.
name is Stacy Midi. I'm originally from Haiti, but now I'm in Miami, Florida. I am an alumni of the course. I've been in the second class of social medicine, and on the window right now, I'm a 5. I'm calling on Elias.
Hi, thanks, Stacy. Good to see you again. My name's Elise. I am a medical student and anthropology student in Berkeley, California, which is where I'm calling in from. And in the window today, I would say I'm a 2. And je passe la parole à Rosanna.
Merci. Rosna?
Hi, everybody. My name is Rosna. I'm so happy to be there with you. I'm a student nurse. I'm in Haiti. In the windows, my number is 2. Right now, I call Catherine Perpetia.
Merci, Rosna.
Bonsoir tout le monde.
Bonsoir, Catherine.
Je suis Catherine Perpetia-Narigo. Je viens d'Haïti et je suis en 5e année de médecine à l'Université Notre-Dame d'Haïti. Et sur la fenêtre, je suis à 5 et j'appelle Michel Morse.
Merci, Catherine. Bonsoir encore tout le monde. Je m'appelle Michelle Morse. Je suis à Washington, D.C. et je suis cofondatrice de Equal Health. Moi, je suis 1, positif 1 dans la fenêtre et je vais passer la parole à Rowena.
Ok, avant de commencer, Rowena, s'il vous plaît, je tiens à rappeler à tout le monde que lorsque vous n'arrivez pas à prendre la parole, s'il vous plaît, priez de mettre vos microphones sur muet. Put your microphone on mute when you are not going to talk. Please. Okay, Rowena? Sorry, Rowena, we can't hear you. Not yet. Bernier, est-ce que
How
tu veux
about now?
Now, yes, Rowena.
Okay. Hi, I'm Rowena. I'm a medical student in Berkeley, California, and my number in the window is a 4. And I'll pass on to Alexa.
Bonsoir tout le monde. Je suis Alexandra Joseph, interne à la faculté de médecine de l'Université de la Fondation Dr Aristide. Aujourd'hui, je suis +2 sur la fenêtre. J'appelle Bernier.
Hello, everybody. I am Bernier Ronaldo, and I'm in Haiti. I'm a medical student, and I'm very happy to be here today. So my number on the window is a +1.
Thanks, Ronaldo. Who you calling on? Can you call someone?
I call Zadok.
Right. Hi, everybody. My name is Doc Sachs. I'm an internist and pediatrician in California. I work with the family medicine residents at Ventura County Medical Center, and I'm co-founder of Equal Health with Michelle. With Fernando and David. Did everybody go?
No, not yet.
Oh, the window. Sorry. As evidenced by me forgetting the window, I'd say I'm maybe a -2. It took me almost 24 hours to get home from Minnesota. I'm sure the number will increase during this call. Let's see. Ruth go? Yeah, Ruth.
Bonjour tout le monde, je m'appelle Ruth Strauss, je suis infirmière praticienne et anthropologue médicale et j'enseigne avec l'équipe de Equal Health et je pense que je suis 2 dans la fenêtre et je passe la parole à Rosena. Est-ce qu'elle a déjà parlé?
Oui.
Ah, d'accord.
The last one is Casey.
OK. Je passe la parole à Casey.
Merci, Ruth. Hey guys, this is Casey calling in from Boston finally. At about a -6 in the window. I haven't slept since like Sunday night, but super excited to be here.
Sorry, Casey.
It's okay.
Okay, guys. Don't forget to keep looking at the chat on Zoom for the translation. S'il vous plaît, il faut toujours surveiller la traduction sur l'espace de conversation de Zoom parce que les professeurs vont présenter uniquement en anglais et Casey, Michel et moi, nous allons, et Ruth, bien sûr, nous allons essayer de faciliter la traduction. Est-ce que c'est bon pour tout le monde? Si c'est bon, je veux avoir des thumbs up. OK, parfait. Donc, merci beaucoup et encore une fois, bienvenue à Fernando.
Okay, well, hi again, everybody. And before we start, a big thanks to all the people who are going to help translate. Please remind us if we start to speak too fast or we go over something too quickly, and we'll try to slow down. I know that David and I both want to make this session as useful to the students as possible. We can talk forever, but we don't want to do that, right? We want to have a good discussion and ask good questions and look at some interesting data together. And I know that we're both looking forward to welcoming you in Chicago this year. And unfortunately, we could not do that, but we're glad that we can have this as an alternative way of getting to know one another and sharing some of our work. I'm going to share some slides to help give our conversation some structure. So let's see if this works. Can everybody see the slides?
Yes.
Looks good.
Thumbs up.
Okay. So David, please jump in whenever you'd like. We'll kind of intermix our observations and discussion along the way.
Sounds good.
Okay, good. So very broadly, we want to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing in Chicago, looking at community level data and a sense of history and how history matters, and how structural violence plays out over generations in a large US city. Very important for us to try to get a discussion about why the Chicago experience might be relevant to you in Haiti, and also why your experience in Haiti is important to us here in Chicago. So these are some of the things that I thought we could go over, and I tried to put up some of the text in French, thanks to Google Translate. I can't promise the translation's any good, but it was our attempt at doing that. So part of the conversation will be about this book. David and I and a couple of colleagues, John Mazu and Ross Shaw, co-edited this past year, called Community Health Equity, a Chicago Reader. I think it tells an interesting story relevant to social medicine about this city. And it illustrates, I think, some of the ideas that we get from Paul Farmer, which of course is a key figure that I bet ties a lot of our interests together. Let me pause for 1 sec to try to get the... I was going to see if... No, it's okay. Okay. So the two key ideas from Farmer that I bet we all have in common as foundational is the concept of structural violence. So we want to walk through what that means in the context of Chicago, and what a geographically broad and historically deep analysis means, and why it's useful to public health and health equity and social medicine. And in the second half of the talk, we're going to try to run through 3 examples, 2 of which we've been able to translate in French, and so I hope the students have had a chance to read. One is a very old piece that we included in our book, which proclaimed Chicago as the world's healthiest city. And we'll look at some of the data about why that was a lie. Next, we'll look at a pamphlet put together by called What Color Are Your Germs? That called out racial segregation in Chicago hospitals. And the last example that we'll look at is on structural racism, breast cancer, and something that David has worked on for many years. Is that okay? Okay. Now, before we start looking at some data, David and I wanted to ask a question to the students, just to kind of get a sense of a little bit more about who you are and what you hope to get out of this conversation. And that is, what interests you in this social medicine course? What are some useful things that you have learned so far? If maybe 1 or 2 students could share some reflections, that would be great.
Mm-hmm.
Any volunteers? I would also invite the course faculty as well, as you run through your notes and you're thinking of the past few sessions, what have been some of the most kind of important ideas that have circulated for the group?
Don't be shy. This is David Ansell. Please.
Bon, c'est Michel. Je peux dire que pour moi, une des choses qui était, une des choses que j'ai appris, c'est pendant la présentation de professeur Murray. Elle a partagé beaucoup d'histoires sur la connexion entre les systèmes de racisme, les systèmes structurels de racisme Et moi, j'ai pas connu qu'il y avait tant de lynching des Mexicains aux États-Unis pendant la période de l'esclavage et après la guerre civile. Alors, c'est une des choses que j'ai appris qui était vraiment étonnante pour moi.
Merci beaucoup. Anyone else? A key concept that you've come across or another key finding that you found very important? All right, if not, we will try to give you some more things to talk about from our presentation today. Let me also check, is the language okay? Am I speaking too fast or too slow? It's okay? All right, thanks, Carlo. Okay, so a little bit of background on Chicago, and this would have been most relevant to the students, of course, if you were actually coming here in person, but even if you're not here, important to get a little bit of sense of what the city is like and why we might be interested in it from the perspective of social medicine. Chicago is the third largest city in the United States after New York City and Los Angeles. And in almost all indicators it comes across, it measures as one of the most unequal cities in the United States, with a very deep pattern, a very long-standing pattern of segregation by race, ethnicity. So on these three maps, on the far left, you have the clustering or concentration of Hispanic and Latino people, in the middle of non-Hispanic Black, and on the far right map, you have the concentration of non-Hispanic white respondents. And for many people in public health and increasingly in social medicine, this is a fundamental fault line, right? The key social division that affects our city, along with income distribution. And of course, these maps are not natural. They were created by public policy. And more people in public health and social medicine, I think, are beginning to acknowledge and recognize that and put that at the center of our thinking. So most major US cities have a map like this that were created in the 1930s that essentially robbed generations of wealth and the capacity to generate wealth over time. They're the famous redlining maps that at least the students in the United States may have seen before, that effectively pushed out African American families from accessing the mortgage market. There's been a lot of great books written on this lately, including The Color of Law, which I think is only available in English, but it's subtitled The Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, a very vivid analysis of how these maps came to be as the result of public policy. And one of my favorites, written by sociologist Doug Massey, called American Apartheid, which is probably as strong a title as you could imagine, but I think accurate in its illustration. This segregation and the making of the underclass was a purposeful thing, was a man-made thing made through public policy.
So maybe, Fernando, just for a second,
sure,
for people to understand, especially those in Haiti, that U.S. law and public policy kept Black people and Latin American immigrants at the same time from being able to access funding to buy housing. And therefore, white people could have access to that and not Black people. And that officially changed by law in, I think it was about 1977. It was went on for a very, very long period of time, but but actually determined who lived in what neighborhoods in a city like Chicago, but across large cities all across the United States.
Yeah, great point. And these maps have a history, right? And they have a legacy. So this is the most up-to-date data in the city of Chicago, mapping what we call the hardship index, which is kind of this composite indicator that puts together a lot of bad things. Unemployment, crowded housing, all kinds of negative social indicators into this one index score. And in many ways, this is a reflection of these deep historical maps that we might see in other sources. So we have a hardship index, we have a childhood opportunity index that similarly concentrates in the south and west sides of the city, where predominantly African American and Hispanic residents live. This is a map of infant mortality that has been quite important in a lot of my work and a lot of my thinking. Mirrors very much what we see with the childhood opportunity index and what we see with the hardship index. And in a few slides, I'll show you what this map looked like in the 1930s. But maybe for now, very important to note the gross inequality that we have within this one city, right? The best off communities have an infant mortality of 1.4 per 1,000 live births, and our worst off communities, almost 25. This is a map of life expectancy, and just about every health indicator that we can imagine concentrates in this similar way in the south and west sides of the city, and again with very, very dramatic ranges from the worst off to the best off.
And just to add, these are neighborhoods in which, so they're fairly large, but when you look at smaller areas in Chicago, the life expectancy gap between the highest life expectancy neighborhood and the lowest life expectancy neighborhood is about 30 years. And it's the largest of any city in the United States. So where you live, what neighborhood you live on, really determines how long you get to live.
Yeah. This is a correlation of two things, of that hardship index that I showed you before, a very rough measure of kind of the socioeconomic standing of that community. The lowest number indicates low hardship and a high number indicates high level of hardship, and a plot with life expectancy on the y-axis. You see a generally negative association, of course. As hardship goes up, life expectancy goes down. But I'm curious if particularly any of the students see any other stories hiding in these data points. Each triangle, each data point represents a different community. There's 77 of them. And again, there's a general downward trend. But do you see anything else in the data? Or questions that you would kind of see that you'd want to know more about?
For me, it looks like as the index of community hardships increases, the line diverges, or like the distribution of the dots diverge.
Yeah.
And I wonder what causes that divergence.
Yeah, great observation. So let's see if I can get fancy and get a pen here. Will this work? So you have a clustering of communities up here. And similarly, a clustering of communities down here, perhaps. Right? So it's true, there's great, what statisticians call heterogeneity. There's a lot of variance at that upper end of the hardship index. And it turns out that these communities up here are the predominantly African-American, predominantly Hispanic communities. And the communities down here are the predominantly African-American communities in Chicago. So at similar levels of economic hardship, we're seeing some evidence that racism and discrimination gives a particularly heavier toll among African-American communities, as we would expect, but now we see it visually in data.
And people are beginning to look at that more deeply. And so in the United States, for many of these communities, these are relatively recent arrivals to the United States. And so there is one theory that people who have to undergo through the hardships of migrating might have more physiological resilience. And there's people who can't come don't. But other folks are beginning to think about disability impacted life expectancy. So you can live a long time, but is your health really good? And there's not as much data that we have in the United States on the Latino population, but a lot of questions abound. Is this really a reflection on overall better health and maybe less historic oppression, or are there are other things going on.
Yeah. Yeah, all good observations. If particularly if any of the students have any questions as we go along, please chime in. So one of the things that
can we just say one thing about this? Race and ethnicity are used in the United States as self-identifiers. So oftentimes these are how either people are self-identified or have been identified by others. And the idea even behind classifications by ethnicity and race are inherently, these are inherently social constructs by themselves and are artificial. And it reflects, the underlying historical racism in the United States and the history of slavery. So they're actually crude. They really speak more to social status and conditions than, but race is the way in which data is, and ethnicity is which data is collected and therefore analyzed in the United States. So I would just point that out as well.
Yeah. Yep. So one of the things that David and I have worked on is this book that came out a few months ago, which was kind of this crazy idea to kind of collate and edit a collection that told the story of the city of Chicago over more than 100 years, right? Of people practicing progressive public health and social medicine and related fields. And so this is a rough compilation, and the students have two of the readings, the What Color Are Your Germs, and some of the breast cancer work that's also in this book. The very first map that we have for the city of Chicago, at least that we were able to find, is this map here. And this was published in 1901 in the American Journal of Sociology. We, of course, have better data now, better mapping techniques, but I found this map very interesting. If you look at what it's plotting, child mortality, overcrowding, foreign population, things that we still map today and still find relevance in. It's also plotting criminality and ignorance. No one plots ignorance anymore, but I thought it was interesting that they tried to do that. And economic distress, which of course is the fundamental thing that we still try to plot today. So this was 1901. By the 1930s, the maps produced by researchers in the city improved dramatically. Actually, we had these 77 officially designated areas. This was a key piece of the early Chicago School of Sociology, plotting insanity rates by community areas. And then more recently, people have generated far more interesting and sophisticated maps, right? This was a key map that identified trauma deserts in the south side of the city. So if you were shot and didn't have access to an adult trauma center, this plotted that distance to that nearest hospital. And the book is kind of a collection of many of these kinds of studies. At the same time, we also collected and saw a great deal of value in advocacy, so not just empirical research and statistics, but in efforts by a lot of people, including this letter by Dr. Quentin Young, to champion, right, health equity as a social cause. So this was a letter that he wrote on behalf of the Medical Committee for Human Rights to the President's Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, calling out racial segregation in Chicago area hospitals as a civil rights issue. The pamphlet that we've shared for today is What Color Are Your Germs? We'll come back to this one, but we also found it to be a very eloquent, very powerful call to action based on data. And in the book, we also have stuff from the Black Panthers, who ran a very important sickle cell program in North Lawndale in the absence of any official government program of the like. And lastly, the book culminates in protest, right? And this was a protest geared at the University of Chicago to reopen up an adult trauma center to deal with the gun violence issue in the city. It was very much informed and fueled by empirical research. And for me, that was a very inspiring example of where research and advocacy researchers and doctors and community members marshaled their collective action together.
If I could just point out, it was largely community members and very few doctors.
Okay.
Just to put this into context, and having been one of those doctors that was involved with this, it was quite striking how few physician leaders in the city of Chicago spoke up about the trauma. And one is posed maybe to the audience, or just a question of sort of why don't doctors speak up more in the face of these sort of social conditions. I don't know if anyone on the phone wants to jump in or speculate on what keeps doctors from being sort of a voice like we see in this photo.
Well, if you're taught that your only job is really to diagnose and treat illness, the biological piece of it, I don't know where you would ever learn that that there's a context for illness, and that if we don't deal with that context, we can write all the prescriptions we want, but we're never going to fix all these illnesses. But we don't teach I'm a nurse practitioner, and I teach nurse practitioner students, and we don't teach a lot of that in our programs either.
Donc, je vois que Stacy est en train d'essayer de traduire en français, mais je peux le dire très vite pour les personnes qui parlent français. La question posée par Dr. Ansell, la question était pourquoi est-ce que les médecins en général n'ont pas l'habitude de participer dans les manifestations comme ça ou participer dans les mouvements pour la justice sociale? Pourquoi est-ce que très souvent c'est les membres de la communauté par exemple, mais c'est les médecins ne sont pas présents, ils ne sont pas là. Pourquoi? Pourquoi est-ce que les médecins ne participent pas dans les mouvements et dans les manifestations?
I had some other thoughts as well. This is probably more specific to the US context, but I think that when we think about who is a physician in the US, there's often a real class divide between physicians and the people that they're treating. And so maybe physicians in the US aren't necessarily always feeling the same social pressures that are experienced by their patients, and aren't motivated in the same ways because of this kind of elite character of the physician workforce in the US. And like the American Medical Association, for example, has historically been a very conservative, politically conservative organization, maybe because of some of those same trends.
Yeah, those are all good observations. Anybody else want to chime in? Okay. Well, I wanted to come back to the inframortality map, and I bet you this is one map that will never get doctors protesting on the street, because for the most part, this is accepted as part and parcel of life, right? This is what a capitalist society might look like. That inframortality rates vary dramatically from area to area, and we accept it as a natural part of life. So this is the map that we have now, 2010-14, the latest data published by our public health department. And this is what the map looked like in 1939. To be clear, every community experienced an improvement, right? Every community experienced a drop in infant deaths. Every community experienced an increase in life expectancy. But what we try to argue in the book is that the fundamental problem didn't change, right? The fundamental problem was inequality between the areas. Yes, every community experienced some improvement, but the variance, the heterogeneity that we see today is very similar to the patterns that we see now. The communities are different, of course. Some were disadvantaged, now are advantaged. There are some changes. but the fundamental problem is the inequality across the areas. And so this is where some of Paul Farmer's work has meant a lot, I think, to both me and David. So the framing of all of this is an act of structural violence and the need to have a geographically broad and historically deep analysis, right? To understand infant mortality in North Lawndale, one of our poorest communities, we can't understand it in isolation from the rest of the city and indeed from communities in other places as well. So I bet you everyone on this call has read Farmer's books, maybe from beginning to end. If you haven't, these are two of my favorites. And the piece that is probably most important, I think, is in one of the readings for the next class or the one after. And that's this definition that he published with some co-authors in 2006 of what structural violence is. Of social arrangements that put individuals and populations in harm's way. The arrangements are structural because they are embedded in the political and economic organization of our world. They are violent because they cause injury to people. Right? So the violence that we're talking about here is infant mortality and low birth weight and gun violence and a range of other things. I see someone has raised their hand. Let me pause. I can't read the comments. I wonder if someone could read the comment out loud.
Bernier, est-ce que tu voulais dire quelque chose? Ronaldo, tu viens de lever la main. Est-ce que tu aimerais dire quelque chose?
Non, non.
Mais tu viens de faire signe de la main. Eh bien, ok. Pas de problème. Okay. Keep going, Fernando.
Okay. I do like the hand raising function. That seems nice.
Exactly. I saw it also.
All right. So a paper that we don't have.
Désolé. Gustave, est-ce que les gens qui ont des difficultés avec l'anglais arrivent à comprendre? J'essaie de résumer l'essentiel sur les conversations. Est-ce que vous pouvez dire ce que j'ai
fait? Oui, Bernier. Tu viens encore de le faire, Ronaldo. Tu viens encore de lever la main. Est-ce que ça va pour tout le monde? Est-ce que ça va avec la traduction? Est-ce que vous arrivez à lire correctement les traductions faites par Stacy et Michel? Si ça va, il faut faire signe. Alexandra, ça va? Rosna, ça va?
Ça va, merci, docteur. Tout va bien.
Catherine, ça va? Ok, pas de problème.
Oui, oui, ça va.
Ok, merci beaucoup. On peut continuer.
Okay. Continue?
Yes, please.
All right. So this concept of structural violence is kind of intertwined throughout our book and the work that we're trying to do in Chicago. One of the papers that we've written, I'm happy to share this with anybody who might be interested. We only have it in English. We don't have it in French. But it's kind of an exploration of the concept of structural violence, where it came from in the work of Johan Galtung in the 1960s, and how it's been applied in health research, both in the global south and in the global north. And we laid out an analysis that suggests that it has certain advantages over the more passive term of the social determinants of health. Yet it also has many weaknesses in how it's being utilized in research in largely atheoretical and apolitical ways. One of the ways that we've tried to apply the concept is through a series of papers looking at low birth weight. And this is something that has interested a lot of social medicine people and public health and indeed in sociology as well. And a growing consensus of racism as a root fundamental cause of poor health outcomes for African American babies in particular. So this, of course, is not a problem just in Chicago. It's a US-wide problem. This is a concentration of low birth weight per life births. For the students who don't know where Chicago is, we're right here, the southern tip of Lake Michigan. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about this one paper, and then we'll move on to those 3 case studies that we have for discussion. So this was an analysis that David and I published looking at community level data from Chicago and Toronto in Canada, which is very much an apples and oranges comparison, right? Different healthcare systems, different welfare systems, different populations. And that was kind of the point. We wanted to see how different things could be. So this is the Chicago map of low birth weight. In our best off communities, like the one just outside my window, the low birth weight prevalence comes down to about 3.5. And in our worst off communities, it goes up to about 20%. And this is the map in Toronto. There's 140 neighborhoods versus 77 communities. They're slightly smaller, ours are slightly larger. But I'm curious if anyone has any observations about the actual map that we produced. Notice that the scale is the same. We took the scale from Chicago and applied that scale to Toronto and generated that map using that scale. Any kind of gut reactions to the Toronto map? Or what are some big differences between the two maps, perhaps? I'm not sure if you'll agree, but to me, the Toronto map looks pretty good. That's what health equity looks like, right? There are, yes, a couple of pockets of difference, but mostly it's a uniform map. And if we look closer at the data, we'll see that Toronto effectively cut out the lower half of the low birth weight distribution. So their worst off neighborhood was on par with our average neighborhood. And I know we don't want to get into the weeds of the statistics, but I do want to show you one of the results looking at some associations with these data.
Can we just go back to that slide just one more time? So the other thing you see not only is, so Toronto and Chicago are both cities of 3 million people, literally a plane flight over a lake. So, and both have large Black populations, though the Canadian population has a different history than the American. So those are two things. The other thing is you just don't see much variation at all in Toronto, where there's a large degree of variation in Chicago.
Yeah. And that's what really interested us. What kind of variation exists? To be sure, Toronto is not a utopian place. There's poverty, there's inequality, there's racism, there's sexism, there's all these horrible things. But they've done something very interesting. And so I just want to walk you through just one little bit of results, and then hopefully we'll have more time for discussion. And so I want to look at, that's the correlation for Chicago, a strong and positive association. And this is the association between low birth weight and percentage minority in a community in Toronto, a very small and non-significant result. And if we plot the results, this is what they look like. On the y-axis, you have the low birth weight prevalence. On the x-axis, you have the a measure of segregation in a community, the percentage that is minority. The Chicago data are in red and the Toronto data are in black. First, notice a very steep association in Chicago, right? And so this is two hyper-segregated communities in our city where almost 100% of residents are non-white and low birth weight prevalence hovers around 20%. What do you see with the Toronto data, the data in the black triangles? And we can disregard the equation and the numbers, more just an interpretation of the visual. Any thoughts? For me, one of the striking patterns is, of course, that it's a flat line, right? We have lots of hyper-segregated communities in Toronto, including this one here, where maybe 95% of residents are minority, yet their low birth weight prevalence is on par with the majority white communities. So essentially there's no association within the Toronto communities and a very steep association between the Chicago communities. Next, we wanted to see if Chicago was unique or if it was on par with other US cities. So we added data from Boston, so I'm glad there's Boston people on the call, Baltimore and Philadelphia, communities or cities that we had community level data available for. And so these are the data adding Boston on top. Notice that Boston doesn't have the same slope as Chicago, but the data isn't too different and certainly not at all like Toronto. Adding data from Philadelphia, the fifth largest city in the United States, in green. The slope is very, very similar to Boston. And then adding data from Baltimore, the yellow dots, we have a very Chicago-like pattern, right, with this concentration of communities, in particular in the upper right quadrant. And of course, these are just dots on a scatter plot, but they're also communities, right, with history and with memory and people and families. So for me, a very important pattern that we see here. A couple more scatter plots, and then we'll kind of shift away because I know we're not a stats class. But we want to see what this looks like in terms of history, right, and how it tracks back. So I had a colleague in the public health department who had this very interesting report just filed away in a filing cabinet. It's not available online that I could find. It was just sitting in someone's filing cabinet, and they gave us data going back to 1979 for each community area. So this is what the association looks like in Chicago between poverty rates on the x-axis and low birth weight on the y-axis. Each dot, again, represents a different community in the city. And we'll have data in 4 time periods, 1980, 1990, 2000, and 2010. As we zoom forward 10 years, any ideas what happened to the data? Or perhaps put differently, what would you want to see if we had a health system, a welfare system geared towards equity? What would happen to this line? It would come down, right? It comes down if the overall prevalence of low birth weight decreases, and it becomes shallower if we're able to break the link between poverty and low birth weight. And what actually happened if we zoom forward 10 years is that we made no change at all. The blue dots became red dots. We went from 1980 to 2000, and there was no change at all in the overall prevalence of low birth weight or in the association with poverty rates. You zoom forward 10 years after that to 2000, the blue dots became red dots, became yellow dots, and again, no change at all in that relationship or in the prevalence of the problem. And then the most recent data that we have, again, no change at all. And for me, that's a very depressing fact, right? If you think of all the healthcare expenditure, all the well-intentioned people and programs that we might launch at something like this, it truly made no dent at all. So a question for the group, is this a manifestation? Is this an example of structural violence? Or would you not call it structural violence? Would you call this something else? If you think back to Farmer's definition of social and political arrangements that harm populations, are we seeing some kind of historical evidence of these patterns over time here, or is this something else? Any takers?
I would argue that yes, this is structural violence, because like looking at like Toronto versus Chicago or any of the other major cities in the US, it looks like being in poverty or not having a high income doesn't result in like an increase in low birth rate or infant mortality. But just by being in the US and being poor, our economic and social and healthcare systems are causing more infants to die, in addition to all the other health effects that result from infant mortality in communities. So because we have either a lack of infrastructure or an oppressive infrastructure, this is harming our population.
Great. Thanks, Rowena. That's a good observation. And it's very different to one of the reactions that we got to this work. So when we first published the Chicago-Toronto comparison, a local magazine here in Chicago asked us to write an editorial about it. It's a magazine primarily to and towards the business community, kind of like a local economist. And I'll always remember one of the comments from a self-identified doctor on the online comments, saying that this was not a scientific study about racism or discrimination. This was about poor people having babies when they shouldn't be having babies. Right? That this was not structural violence. This was the bad behavior of individual people. So there's a lot of work to be done, right, in how we convey these messages and potentially how we open up dialogue with people who are otherwise opposed to seeing the structural violence interpretation of these data. Any other thoughts or observations before we move on?
Well, I mean, the data on the infant mortality and maternal mortality for African-American women in the United States is pretty clear that it has zero to do with your income. It has zero to do with your access to health care. It has, because African-American women are dying educated African-American women are dying at rates higher than white women with who have high school diplomas. So clearly the issue is racism. It clearly is that we do not care about the lives of Black women the way we do about white women. But I don't know how to, the data is very clear. I don't know how to get people to understand this and say, oh wow, this is really a problem.
Thank you, Ruth. Any other thoughts or observations or critique of the data? Okay. Well, one other question that we wanted to kind of pause and open up for reflection with the students, particularly the students in Haiti, is do you see any similarities or any differences between Chicago and Port-au-Prince with regard to the social and historical conditions that promote health and illness? You've seen here a little bit of the Chicago experience, rooted primarily on segregation. And we're curious what the story would be like in Port-au-Prince or in other cities that you might be familiar with. Of course, people can speak in French, and then Carlo might help us translate back into English. If not, maybe we'll save the question for the end. All right, coming back to the book and these three kind of case studies that we thought we could discuss with you. Sorry, I meant to have that in French, but obviously it's not there. But the book is divided into 5 sections: a divided city, looking at that social divisions; the health gap, which is primarily the public health and medical research documenting health disparities; separate and unequal health care, looking at the segregation in the hospital system in particular; communities matter, looking at community level characteristics that influence health or nurture good health; and then taking action, which was by far the hardest part of the book to write because there's very little written, at least in the scientific literature. There's a lot of problem description and far less in the solution space.
Your kids are so adorable. Did you go to the lake?
So in part one of the book, A Divided City, we have this one article that I want to tell you a little bit about called Negro Mortality Rates in Chicago. And then we'll look at some of the breast cancer work that David has spearheaded. So again, just to give us a sense of history and how this discussion has played out over time. In the mid-1920s and 1927, Chicago was proclaimed the world's healthiest city by the health commissioner. And this was a story in one of our local newspapers. I know you can't read it very well, but it says that the ranking of world cities showing the number of deaths per 1,000 population is as follows. Chicago, 11.3, Berlin, 11.7, New York, 12.2, Vienna, 12.9, and so on. And the numbers show that Chicago was indeed the healthiest city in what the article called the civilized world. It's kind of interesting language. And then researchers said, well, yes, this is true, but it's only true if we only count white people. So they did the same analysis, breaking down mortality rates between white and black Chicago residents. So people have been telling the story of inequality for a very, very long time, right? And I think it's all of our hopes in public health and social medicine or whatever identity you have, right, of doing some work that changes this fundamental picture. So this article from the 1920s was very sophisticated, plotting death rates by city, disaggregating it for black and white in Chicago, looking at different causes of death in overall terms, and again, disaggregated for whites and blacks. Dramatic differences in tuberculosis, for example. And then much like people do today, they plotted how these things change between areas, looking at different wards and looking at the death rates per ward. Again, the work hasn't changed that much since the 1920s. We have better computer software to do this work now with, but the fundamental idea has stayed roughly the same. And the fundamental problem has also stayed the same. So these were death rates for tuberculosis, a persistent or stable, relatively stable line for black residents at the top, and a decline for whites along the bottom. Something that I think was echoed in very graphic ways with David's breast cancer work that we'll see in a few minutes, many, many decades later. One article that I hope the students have been able to read came from the 1950s, 1954. It's a pamphlet put together by a committee of doctors in the city called What Color Are Your Germs? I don't think this graphic was in the translation, but it was kind of described. And it shows the voyage that a person would take if they lived in the far south of the city. It showed the voyage that they would take in ambulance, bypassing 28 hospitals that were not serving African Americans until they got to Cook County Hospital, the hospital where the majority of African Americans were treated in the city. I'm curious of the students who had the time and were able to read that report in English or in French. Was there anything about that pamphlet that caught your attention that you would want to know more about? What was your kind of gut reaction to it? Or David, if you have other observations about that report, this would be a good time too.
I think one theme that comes through in all of this, that this report was written in part by a group that included physicians. Mm-hmm. Two, it's really important that we restate the narrative mm-hmm. of what's happening and make things that are seemingly invisible visible. And mm-hmm. we're going to see that later in the breast cancer discussion on structural racism. And the third, it's narrative is important and data is critically important to restating the narrative, but then change doesn't occur without civic action. And what I can tell you that laws, because of activism on the part of physicians and others, laws were changed in the United States to make what happened in this situation illegal in the United States. It's illegal, at least on the books, to have a hospital refuse a patient in an emergency condition for lack of insurance or because of race. And both of those reasons were reasons why hospitals in the United States, up until very recently, could refuse to see patients.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting observation that the physicians were involved and led the writing of this report. So there have been spaces where social medicine types have raised their voices very eloquently. Okay, zooming forward to the 1990s and 2000s, you have this great work of structural racism and breast cancer that David has been a part of.
Well, let me, this is David here, David, for those of you who speak French. You know, first I want to just point this out, that one is these phenomenon in the phenomenon of social medicine, or the necessity for physicians and nurses and administrators to practice social medicine has been evident for, you know, let's say hundreds of years. Most notably raised in the mid-19th century and then lost in many ways. And the New England Journal of Medicine this year, the leading journal of medicine in the world, with the urging of Paul Farmer, Michael Marmot, a famous epidemiologist from Great Britain, and others, probably some of you on the phone are associated with the others, pushed the New England Journal of Medicine to begin to include a series on social medicine. And I do recommend that if you can get these articles translated into French and Creole, I'm sure the New England Journal is in French, they are really worth reading. The last one was really fantastic, by a colleague in Chiapas on misrecognition. It was really the idea that as patients come to doctors, that they come with us, if we misrecognize the root causes of disease, then we will mistreat it. So this article was one in that series, and it's about work that we had done in Chicago really over the past 30 years, looking at breast cancer mortality disparity in the city. And in the city of Chicago, white women and Black women had the exact same breast cancer mortality in the 1980s. You can see this is a curve from a paper a number of years ago. And the red dots are the white breast cancer mortality, and the black dots are the blue dots are the black breast cancer mortality. And you can see they were for many years the mortality was almost exactly the same. And then in the mid 1990s, the mortality curves began to diverge, and the white rate was reduced by almost 50%, and the Black rate did not move at all. And we published a paper on this in mid 2000. I think it was published in 2007, 2006, that showed this. And there were three hypotheses that we put forward. But before we get to that, what had been introduced in between these graphs, these lines diverging, was breast cancer screening with mammography and advances in breast cancer treatment with adjuvant chemotherapy. So there was a new technologies introduced. And then Black women, it was like as if Black women in Chicago had not benefited at all, not even one iota, from all of these advances in breast cancer treatment. And when we published this article, the narrative in Chicago was that it was biological, that Black women had worse biological characteristics of their cancer, which was largely, which had some truth to it. They were more likely to be estrogen and progesterone receptor negative, more likely to have triple negative breast cancer. And while all those things were true, we didn't think that explained it. And what we named as the root cause was structural racism. But there was, of course, a huge pushback from the scientific committee in the face of these biological characteristics of cancers that people were seeing. So then we decided that in order to show that it was structural in nature and not just biological in nature, we showed breast cancer in Chicago, the breast cancer disparity in Chicago, meaning the Black to white rates in Chicago compared to the United States as a whole, compared to New York City, a city you may have heard of, a large city on the East Coast of the United States. That was a joke. And what you can see is the disparity was different in New York City. In fact, in New York City, in some years, there was no disparity. In the United States, it was a bigger Black-white disparity. And of course, Chicago had the biggest disparity of all, which led us to ask the question, what happened to Black women's genes when they crossed the country? Of course, it's an absurdity that there would be biological differences of this magnitude over geography. And this actually was one way that we were able to point out the structural nature of this racial difference. And I want to just pause for a second to reflect back on Fernando's discussion of structural violence, which is a concept that Paul Farmer reintroduced, but doesn't have a measure associated with it. We think this is a great way to show, in some ways, a measure of structural racism. The New York City data, which has actually gotten worse over time, the gap, for reasons that we won't discuss here, but for pretty clear reasons that's gotten worse, was almost at a non-existent gap. So this was not baked into biology. It was baked into the structures in the ways society is run, in which you can see even these regional differences in mortality. And I just will finish with this note. Recently, in the last couple of years, economists out of Stanford published an article on life expectancy in the United States and by geography. And it turns out that not only is there a as we see in all countries, a life expectancy gap between the rich and the poor, but where you're poor in the United States can affect your life expectancy up to about 8 years. So it's better to be poor in some cities than in other places in the United States if you want to live a longer life. Next slide. So this was another way in which we could show how structural racism as one of the root causes of this breast cancer disparity worked. So the green areas on this map of Chicago, if you remember, they look very similar to the low birth weight maps or the hardship index maps that Fernando showed earlier. This is the breast cancer mortality maps of Chicago. And the green areas are the areas that are colored in green or blue are high mortality neighborhoods. And you can see the green ones are predominantly African-American neighborhoods, and the blue one is a predominantly white neighborhood. And then the triangles, the black triangles, are where the hospitals are that have approved cancer programs. And you can see all the approved cancer programs are located on the predominantly north or near west side of the cities. And those areas are lower mortality neighborhoods. In fact, there's only one hospital located on the south side of Chicago, which is a predominantly Black neighborhood. So these are hospitals with approved cancer programs. So where the mortality was, the hospitals weren't. And this is another way, using mapping as a very good way to demonstrate structural violence, how it works, and structural, in this case, structural racism. And so this is the, seemingly innocuous but deadly affliction. And because, there are plenty of other hospitals in those green areas, they just do not have the capital or the quality of the number of specialties you need to get cancer accreditation. And so this sort of violence occurs day in and day out, almost invisibly. And we talk in this paper about a woman who shows up at a hospital in one of these South Side green neighborhoods and with a breast mass. And rather than being treated appropriately, we discuss how all the many ways in which her treatment was inappropriate. And ultimately, a program that we set up in Chicago literally rescued her and got her to a place where she got appropriate treatment. And as she said, just in time before they cut off my breast, which would have been inappropriate. Now, for those of you who've read Paul Farmer, one of Paul Farmer's original articles on structural violence included a description of a woman who shows up with a breast cancer in the Central Highlands of Haiti. And she'd been to, there was a crowd of people. She shows Paul Farmer her breast cancer, which is fungating out of her breast. And she'd been to doctors all over Haiti, none of whom would treat her, and came to the Central Highlands to seek out care that had been refused elsewhere. And it's ironic that both of these cases, the one from Chicago and Paul Farmer's, is used the same kind of case to show how structural violence works. But what we did in Chicago was take action against this. We really had to beat down the biological arguments in the press, on TV. We were always being debated by a very distinguished professor of oncology from either the University of Chicago or Northwestern. But eventually we changed the narrative in Chicago of breast cancer from being one of biological determinism to one of being a social affliction. We created a task force that did a number of different things from a public policy perspective, but also from a navigating perspective of finding women and getting them treated in better centers. And as a result of this work, the breast cancer disparity that you saw in that first slide in Chicago has been reduced. And it's still, the Black-white disparity right now went from 62% to 39%. And a finding that's not been seen in any other city with a large Black population in the United States, Black and white population. So we know that what's critical to this kind of work of social medicine is changing the narrative, in a narrative of affliction from one of biological determinism to social determinants of disease. I call them afflictions that these are afflicted on. So racism and toxic capitalism are afflictions that lead in poverty and lead to late stage disease. But leveraging data like this, you could probably do things similar to this in Port-au-Prince, I suppose. But then taking action, and the action in this case was the creation of a task force. Everyone in every cancer group in the city was against us forming this task force because they said we already had enough groups doing work on cancer, but they weren't attacking the heart of the disparity. So that's what we did, and we talk in this article about ways in which people can take action, and one is by looking at data, but two is by pushing our institutions and our public health systems to do better, because it's the failure of these systems that are causing premature mortality.
Let's pause there. Any questions or feedback to this particular part of the story? Or things you would want to know more about?
One thing you might just note is our use of maps in all of this work is central to this work, is the use of mapping. But I'll stop there. Go on.
Okay, Wowen, I want to say something.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to ask, is there anywhere we could read about specific steps that were taken to reduce this disparity in Chicago? Because I'm just interested in learning like what specific policy actions were taken, for example.
In the article in the New England Journal, we summarize some, but if you're really interested in diving deep, we do have there's a website with all the history and all of the various pieces we publish, and it's called www.breastcancerchicago.org.
Thank you.
It really is a remarkably inspiring story. And I've heard that Memphis is kind of following the lead and initiating a task force of its own, though I haven't seen any published work from them just yet.
Yeah, I think, what this, we really had to battle the biopsychosocial model of medical causation in the city. And I think the work that's been done in Chicago with people who preceded me, Fernando's work and others, has really begun to lead to a narrative change in at least in the city, where structural racism is now commonly named by the newspapers and others in the city as at root cause. People are not so comfortable yet talking about toxic capitalism, but at the root of this, one of the manifestations of structural racism is the removal of capital from these neighborhoods, not just up until the laws were passed in the 1970s, but since that time. And it's the decapitalization of these neighborhoods that have led to the poverty and then premature mortality. But I can say in the city of Chicago, the collective work of many, many people has led to the beginnings of a narrative change about causation.
Yeah. David, could you say a little bit more about the importance of mapping?
Things like, mapping, it's hard to negate arguments when it's hard to actually negate arguments that are based on long-standing belief systems about racial superiority, or in this country, economic determinism. the idea that, if you just work hard enough, you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I mean, both of those things have been inextricably tied together since the pre-formation of what's now the United States of America. And what maps can do, especially given that in our country, we have such concentrated segregation and such concentrated poverty, is illuminate in many ways, make visible what's invisible in the day-to-day narratives that guide our country and our public policies. And I'm sure in Haiti you have the same thing. And it's really, so the maps have been useful to retell a story and allow us to speak frankly about things like racism, and I call it toxic capitalism. I'm not sure there's a non-toxic form of capitalism, but in its extreme versions, it's deadly to people. But it's allowed us to illuminate things like this map. People that may not believe that structural racism exists as an idea. So structural violence, we can't measure. I said structural racism, you can actually measure. I think this map shows you, how does structural racism actually work? How does it actually work in the city of Chicago? And if you're down at the very tip of the city and you got breast cancer, look how far you have to travel before you get to an approved cancer program. And so this actually makes it more visceral in a way. And I do think a lot of our work as physicians and nurses and things can be in this area. That I'm a social epidemiologist, Fernando's a sociologist. We approach this from slightly different perspectives. But if you looked at, this instead of race, of income, you'd see it'd be the same map. And so when people ask, well, is it racism? Is it poverty? It's actually racism, and people have been assigned to poverty by racism, though the Black people are by no means the only people in the United States who've been assigned to poverty. So the maps are useful in this sort of way. And I encourage all of you in your work to think about how you might begin to incorporate this into your own day-to-day work. It's not that hard to do. There's many ways to create maps, and it's a powerful a narrative changer.
Yeah, that's a great challenge to the students. Also, a reminder to be friends with geographers. So reach out and make friends with geographers and historians and anyone else who's in your community. So a couple of slides then to maybe summarize a few ideas, and then hopefully we'll have a few minutes more for discussion and any questions you might have. Was that a question? No. All right, so the bulk of our presentation, and really this book that we've been linking back to is very much a historical book, one that looks backwards into the collective efforts in Chicago to understand and address our marked inequities. And we chose to do that because we know, for a variety of difference, that history matters, that there's value in looking back to see what has worked and what happened. But of course, all of our preoccupation is with the present and with the future. And we probably haven't said anything that you didn't already know before this call started. We're all probably drawn to this work because we know about health disparities, we know about social injustice, and we have hopes of doing something about that. We'll pause for the fire trucks to drive by. I think what all of the graphs have shown is that there have been improvements in most indicators over time. Across the city, people live longer lives than ever before, fewer babies die. Yet the pattern of inequality has not changed substantially, and the centrality of structural violence, particularly structural racism, continues to be very, very strong. If you're interested in learning more about the work that we're doing, I encourage you to check out our center's website called healthequitychicago.org, where there's all kinds of reports and published papers. There's an interview series that we've done called The Voices of Health Equity in Chicago, where we've interviewed doctors and researchers, community activists, about who they are, what they do, how they see the city changing over time. And it's a nice collection of, I think there's like 25 transcripts now, people telling their own personal biographies of how they engage in this work. And I think that resource in particular has a lot of potential value for you in social medicine. There's also all kinds of links to PDFs and PowerPoints and videos from seminars and conferences that we've hosted. All right, one last maybe discussion question that we'll try to prompt you with. In what ways can you and your colleagues practice social medicine in your settings? Might any of these ideas that we've shown you from Chicago have value in your work? Is there any of this, in other words, any of this that that you see value in, that you'd want to maybe adapt and replicate in your setting? Maybe someone who hasn't spoken yet.
Okay.
Or maybe we can pose this slightly differently.
Sure.
What are the challenges of doing this work in your settings?
Mm-hmm.
Monsieur, dame, Haïti, yo, vous en pensez quoi? Monsieur, dame, Haïti, yo. Marc, Rosna, Catherine, Alexandra, Ronaldo, vous en pensez quoi? Je ne vous ai pas entendu réagir aujourd'hui. Est-ce que ça va pour vous ou ça ne va pas?
You know, when I first started teaching, one of my mentors, he taught me, I was worried that the students weren't participating, the class was very quiet, and I talked to him about it, and he said, Fernando, don't worry, maybe they just need time to think. And that's okay if we need some time to think.
Yeah. This is Casey. I would ask a question actually, especially for folks in Haiti.
Yeah.
So, yung question ganyan po mo yo ki Haiti, c'est que, bon, vraiment le même cas yo que Fernando te partagé avec nous. Et on connaît pas gain même situation avec race dans Haïti, mais est-ce qu'on gagne même qualité de disparité sous l'eau accès yo dans Haïti? Ou qui comparaison est-ce qu'on capable de faire? So like, I think, I think that racism looks really different in Haiti. You probably couldn't look at a map like that, of Port-au-Prince, because it's pretty, there's not a lot of racial diversity. So I'm wondering, like, what other axes you might see these disparities along.
Yeah, great.
Thanks, Casey. That's a great question.
Yeah.
Hello? Say it again, Stacy.
No, it was Casey speaking. Sorry, guys.
Okay. Les étudiants haïtiens, est-ce que vous avez compris? Est-ce que vous avez entendu la question de Casey?
Yeah, it's for me, it's a really good question from Casey, right? That even if the fault lines of inequality are different in just about every setting that we can imagine, there is inequality, and I bet you those map onto different health outcomes. I would argue that one of the challenges, or one of the lessons and challenges that we see in this work is that we need to collect the right kinds of data. We need to have the will to ask social justice questions about that data, right? To look at the data from the perspective of health equity, and I don't know, the capacity or the will to work for change, right? Knowing that no one person, whether you're a doctor or a public health or sociologist, by yourself you don't do much. So that's why I'm really interested in the conversation that the consortium as a group is having in this course in particular. David, did you have any other kind of concluding thoughts for the students? You're on mute.
Yeah, I just unmuted myself. What I would just, I think the hardest thing to do is to think how you can actually practice social medicine. This teaching it, having a course, learning about the ideas is one thing, but learning how to practice it requires, I think, a different consideration and effort. And I think it's worthwhile a discussion in one of these classes to talk about how do you take those first steps, because oftentimes you're going up against perceived authority, and we're in a very hierarchical profession in which going up against perceived authority, whether it's been in the medical school or in an institution, is difficult to do. So I would just put that out there. That was always the biggest challenge for me in doing this work, was figuring out strategies to overcome that.
Yeah. Surely one of those strategies is to find the right links, right? The right mentors and the right collaborators.
Yes, that's one of them. And I found, putting the data together in a way that told the story makes certain things easier. As a friend of mine who did this work said, I'm just a mathematician. The numbers speak for themselves. And
Well, here's my problem as an educator. The numbers do speak for themselves, but at the same time, most nursing and medical textbooks are still teaching our students that hypertension in African Americans is genetic, teaching them to do racial correction. We're still teaching racial profiling. Your first on your line of subjective data is this is a 45-year-old black male, blah, blah. So how do you put that all together?
yeah, I mean, that is the challenge. I actually think I've always found in this work having a group of other people to work with has been critical. And I've always said you need 3 people, yourself and 2 others, because hard alone to be the lone voice of this work. And I would seek those out. And then I do think we have to change the way our universities, and we're teaching this work across the world. We are in our own university now, I think because of the work that's been done, is saying what are the competencies that every student, every health science student needs to learn about ideas like structural violence, structural racism, other forms of exploitation as cause of disease. How do we teach social epidemiology? So for the first time, I can say my health science university is beginning to confront that there are indeed competencies, but it does take, we have to just continue to push back against this, and certainly what we would consider the dominant ideology right now. And the last thing I would say is, in my experience with this, one has to be not only unapologetic but relentless in pursuing these types of themes, because you can believe that the opposition is to this is equally relentless. But it does take colleagues. You can't do it alone, and that's been the biggest support I've had through my career, is not only mentors but colleagues who would do this. And I think having Equal Health and the Social Medicine Consortium is a great national configuration, as well as the campaign to end racism in healthcare wherever it exists, and I think it exists all around the world. So that would be my answer to that. Is maybe inadequate, but that's how I've approached it.
All right, are there any other questions or points of devastating critique?
This isn't really a question, it's just a thought that I'm having, or a reflection between today's session and the last session that we had on Friday. Today's session was in some ways very quantitative, and I really appreciated seeing your maps and the data and hearing about how you used kind of these numbers and this language of epidemiology to get this point across about structural racism and structural violence. But alternatively, with our conversation with Linda Ray Murray, I think she really pushed us to think outside the standard paradigms of research that we tend to operate within, and pushed us to see the ways that those standard paradigms have kind of created our current situation. So something that I struggle with personally is how to navigate between speaking this language of data, which I think is important to communicate with people that are currently in power, but also thinking about other ways of thinking about research, innovative models like participatory action research, or other kind of qualitative ideas that aren't qualitative research just for the purpose of converting it into data. So I'm sort of wondering how folks who are farther along in their careers have thought about that.
Yeah. No, that's a great question, Elisa. And I should say that Linda Ray Murray was very kind to write the foreword for our book. And she's very much someone I look up to and respect very much. And I remember one of her talks at the American Public Health Association, where she said that we lie to the young, we lie to students, that we teach them about key values and statistics when real change comes from politics and power. And I humbly disagree with Linda on this particular point. On most other things, I'll agree with her. There's this whole tradition called radical statistics that tries to apply statistical analysis, epidemiology, quantitative methods to study and to study inequality and advocate for change, right? Recognizing that we're not just trying to describe the world, we're trying to change it. So I particularly am one that sees some space for that more critical use of statistical analysis, while still valuing and calling for all the other stuff that you mentioned: qualitative research, participatory research, community-based research. For me, the truth is we need all of that to really understand the complexity of the world.
And maybe I'll just say, when you have a hammer, everything in front of you looks like a nail. So Fernando's a sociologist, and I'm partly a social epidemiologist. But I think I would agree with what Fernando said. My formulation, as I mentioned before, is narrative, which can be qualitative, which is only validated by p-values and statistics. So what people tell you is happening, largely is happening, but you have to show it. Narrative plus data. But I think without civic political action, you don't get change. And the data allows you, and the analysis allows you to make the case. It's not the only way to make the case, but it's one way to make the case to reinforce the case. And I want to leave you on this note. we have a new mayor of Chicago, an African-American woman who has made equity, at least she stated she's made equity the centerpiece for her campaign, and the stripping of capital from Black and brown neighborhoods as a root cause in her mind. She had taken some data that was shared about life expectancy in Chicago along the train routes. And when she kicked off her campaign, she got on one of the routes that had the lowest life expectancy at the end of the route. So I think this stuff is powerful and that it can influence political change. But without the action, it's worthless. It's just a bunch of numbers sitting in a journal.
All right. Well, I thank everybody for your time. I hope you found this conversation helpful and useful. And I look forward to the next sessions in the social medicine class. I think that's it for today.
Thank you so much, Fernando and David.
Thank you so much, Fernando and David. That was amazing.
Thank you so much, guys. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate you sharing your times and your time and your knowledge with us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
If we were actually in person in Chicago, we would be really showing them how to practice. So hopefully,
yeah, for sure,
in the near future.
Next year, hopefully, in the future, yeah.
Better yet,
Bye,
we'll come to them.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah.
Bye, guys.
Okay, Michelle, let me
Good
know.
idea.
Send me details.
Thank you, guys.
For Thursday, beautiful. Will do.
Okay, bye-bye.
Au revoir tout le monde, à demain.
Bonsoir,
Ok,
bonsoir.
bonne nuit tout.
Bonsoir.
Bonsoir.
Allô? Juste avant que vous partez.